Good morning, afternoon, and evening, and welcome to everyone to Global Insights, a live interactive panel discussion that sheds light on big questions currently facing policymakers, planners worldwide. Global Insights features experts from leading institutions in the study of international affairs, including the Balsillie School in Canada, the University of Warwick in the UK, and American University in Washington, DC, and many others. Today's live stream production is entitled Steps Towards a Lasting Peace in the Middle East. My name is Anne Fitzgerald. I'm the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs. A warm welcome to all of you in the audience today. If you would like to ask any of the panelists questions towards the latter part of the session, we would encourage you to use the Q&A function on your Zoom panel, and we'll do our best to direct those questions in to the correct panelists. Before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. The Balsillie School of International Affairs is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations, which is on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. We're very proud to be situated on this land and to acknowledge this in all that we do at the school, particularly our weekly Global Insights panels. Let me now turn to our distinguished panel today. Nathan Funk is an associate professor and chair of the Peace and Conflict Studies at Conrad Grebel University College at the University of Waterloo in Waterloo, Canada. His research addresses religious and cultural dimensions of conflict, peace building, and peacemaking, with a particular focus especially on the Middle East context. Jasmine Habib is Associate Professor in the Political Science Department and Associate Director of the PhD program in Global Governance at the University of Waterloo. Trained as a cultural anthropologist, Dr. Habib focuses on transnational relations between Israel and Palestine, transnational relations to Israel and Palestine. Widely published current ethnographic interests include historicizing the Israeli Communist Party from the perspective of some of its Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian members, and engaging with Israeli immigrants in the US and Canada on their critical distance from the Israel-Palestine conflict. Following an initial career with the Israeli Defense Forces, Uzi Monemi served as a war correspondent across the Middle East region for more than 30 years. 20 of these years were with the Sunday Times as its Middle East correspondent. A graduate of Hebrew University in Jerusalem, he has lectured at many institutions on issues related to Middle East security, including Columbia University and the New York City School of Journalism. Nicola Pratt is an associate professor or reader in the Politics and International Studies Department at the University of Warwick in the UK. She's vice president of the British Society for Middle East Studies. She teaches and researches on the international politics of the Middle East, with a particular interest in feminist and decolonial approaches and the politics from below. Her latest book is entitled Embodying Geopolitics: Generations of Women's Activism in Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon. And Guy Ziv is an assistant professor at American University's School of International Service, where he teaches courses on US foreign policy, international negotiations, US-Israeli relations, and Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. His latest book is entitled Why Hawks Become Doves: Shimon Peres and Foreign Policy Change in Israel. A warm welcome to all of our panelists today. Dating back to Jimmy Carter and the Camp David Accords, there is an expectation that every new administration in Washington will attempt to bring peace to the Middle East. This was definitely true of the Trump administration. And Guy, last year, the Trump administration announced with great fanfare the unveiling of the Abraham Accords, a series of normalization agreements between Israel and Arab states. What do you see happening with these accords in the Biden era?
So there are plenty of Trump-era policies that President Biden has been reversing, and he's going to be reversing plenty in the months ahead. But the Abraham Accords aren't necessarily among them. There are certain aspects of these accords that are problematic and that are presently under review, such as the sale of advanced F-35 fighter jets to the UAE. And it's possible that he's going to reverse Trump's recognition of Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara. but he won't be scrapping the Abraham Accords altogether. I would say, on the contrary, I think he'll want to build on the momentum by continuing the normalization process between Israel and the Sunni Arab regimes. Perhaps Oman and Saudi Arabia, which would be the ultimate prize, will be the next states to do so. But I think that the biggest difference with his predecessor's policy will be bringing in the Palestinians, who were left out in the cold for the past 4 years. And so maybe jumpstarting peace talks are going to be hard to pull off in the next 6 months. That's probably not going to happen, but working to rebuild trust and preserving the two-state solution are doable. And he's already agreed to reopen the PLO office in Washington and restore aid to the Palestinians. And so I see him trying to kind of rebuild that trust that's been lost in the last 4 years with the Palestinians and bringing them back into the fold.
Thanks very much. Just for the sake of the audience and everybody out there, let's rewind a bit. And Nathan Funk, I'd like to ask you how you would characterize Trump's approach in the region.
Sure. No, I'm not going to idealize past U.S. approaches to the region or claim that they were consistently well suited to the challenges that needed to be addressed for the peoples of the Middle East. There have been some continuities with the past. Some of the same geopolitical calculations and principal allies have been consistent throughout, but there have been some very significant departures in the last 4 years. The degree to which policy was coordinated with the Likud party of Israel is quite unprecedented. Partnership with authoritarian governments in the region without lip service to larger principles like human rights or international law or UN resolutions. Maybe they weren't always implemented, but usually when the policy was proceeding, there was some invocation of human rights and other principles as animating elements of policy. The degree to which relationships with key leaders were personalized, working through the president's family, even to top leaders on the other side, and bypassing the typical diplomatic machinery is certainly different. And I'm not going to suggest that every idea or development is uniformly bad. The idea of reducing U.S. military footprint in the region, I'm not going to contest that as something worth talking about. And in the long run, more normalized diplomatic relations in the region would be a great thing to see, but there has to be a stable foundation. There has to be organizing principles that have been ratified by the rest of the world.
Nicola, can you extend on this and talk about any damage you see the Trump administration did to the prospects of peace and security in the region?
So I think that to follow on from what Nathan said, that there was some continuity in Trump's approach to the Middle East and the question of the peace process, in the sense of at least favoring Israel. The only difference is that he favored Israel to a much larger extent than perhaps previous administrations would have overtly admitted to. I mean, he was pretty brazen. I think that's perhaps one of the shocking things about what Trump did. He was very brazen in the way he overrode international principles which had, been the subject of consensus for decades. For example, the status of Jerusalem and the status of the settlements, the Israeli settlements. But in some ways, he laid bare very much some of the problems that have been inherent to US policy towards the Middle East for decades, which is this bias towards Israel. And the Trump plan was just a very brazen attempt to basically give the Israelis everything that they wanted. So I think to the degree to which Biden will row back a bit from that and bring in more of the Palestinian input, as Guy mentioned, I mean, it's a positive thing, but also Biden has said he's not going to move the US embassy back to Tel Aviv. So there will be some elements of the Trump policies that, in a way, Trump managed to move the goalposts quite considerably, and we're not going to go back to the situation that was before the Trump administration in terms of US policy.
Thank you. Uzi, is the two-state solution the only way for peace?
Yes, but it's not only a solution, but before that, I just wanted to a quick remark to the previous speakers. I think that there is an exaggeration of the importance of America in the Middle East, any kind of future peace process. If at all, it should be together with, in my view, Russia, other countries, maybe Canada as well for the first time. And because there is very strong mistrust in the Arab world for the American role, be it Trump or Biden or any American president. So I just suggest not to over-exaggerate the importance of a new administration or previous administration. With all my respect, of course. As for the two-state solution, I think it's dead and buried, even if I personally supported it for many years for obvious reasons. And I think it's just about time to ask the Palestinians, what do they want? The Palestinians in the West Bank mainly, maybe in a way of referendum, not an Israeli referendum, but international referendum. And upon their answer, I think the word should carry on. There are 500,000 of Israelis in the West Bank. It's just impossible to uproot them, and a different solution should be fine.
Thank you. Jasmine, over to you on this issue of one or two states. And why does the focus for peace remain on one or two states? Are there other ways for us to frame a just transformation of the conflict?
All right, well, thank you, Anne. Thanks to the other panelists. Thanks for inviting me. I'm surprised to be in the position of actually speaking to state solutions. I don't actually trust in that the performance of these plans in the first place. I think that, as you suggested, dating back to Jimmy Carter, you know, if we frame the questions around states and borders, then we continually repeat the two-state solution, the one-state solution. I think rather than focusing on states in particular, we might focus on rights, human rights, for example, human rights and a just plan for peace. And the reason I focus my attention on some of this is that I think even if we were to look back and long before Jimmy Carter's entrance into the sort of peace, the performances of peace plans, if we were to look back at what the United Nations proposed in its partition plan, part of the reason for those partition proposals was to find a way to a place of refuge for Jewish refugees and for those who were displaced from the European, from the violence in Europe. And so that isn't the whole picture of it, but that was part of the plan, was to seek safety and security for Jewish refugees. I think if we start from the premise that Palestinians are also deserving of human rights in the same way that Jews were deserving of human rights, if we start from that premise, then rather than starting from the premise of who is deserving of a state or what kind of state or where borders should be positioned, I think it is resolvable. Uzi just made an extremely, I think, important comment about bringing Palestinians in to ask them what it is that they would like. For a very long time, I think Palestinians have been dehumanized to the point where their position as humans, and it's a very basic starting point, but their position as humans who are deserving of the same rights of others has not been part of the picture or the plans or the discussions of those in positions of power to help to resolve this matter.
Thank you. So do we have a sense of how the Biden administration will approach matters of peace in the Middle East? Nathan, back over to you. What was wrong with the Peace Through Prosperity plan?
Sure, I mean, there's a lot that could be said here. I'll keep it very short and simple. First, not talking to the Palestinians, not consulting with them about their own future. Second, putting forward a framework that in denying, core positions that have been emphasized in policy for decades, appears to be simply an effort to buy the Palestinians out. Peace with the Palestinians can't simply be bought as if we were paying them off in exchange for the family farm. There's some fascinating research on the subject of sacred value in negotiations, and the idea that when there's something that disputants have their identity deeply invested in, something that's beyond merely instrumental value, that when you try to have a transaction that is instrumental, exchanging, say, money for something sacred, it actually makes the situation worse. There's a negation of identity and an exacerbation of the scenario. The research supports the idea that when both sides are asked to give up something of sacred value, there's a bit more likelihood that they'll see it as fair. And there may also be some cases in which creative options are possible, where you try to lift what's in dispute outside ordinary interest-based politics. Say there was many years ago an Alexandria initiative where religious leaders from the region were appealing to address holy sites as something that should be beyond the typical national sovereignty frameworks. So there may be creative options. And then finally, then blaming the one third way we could fault the approach is blaming one side after they refuse the bargain. So
Guy, can I ask you how this region features on President Biden's priority list? What country is his priority in the region?
So first, I want to say that there are many, many competing priorities at the moment that are occupying Biden's agenda, from COVID and the economic fallout from this pandemic to fighting climate change. That's been signaled as a high priority for him. Addressing U.S. tensions with China, with Russia, repairing the transatlantic relationship. So there have been many competing priorities here, and so I don't want to exaggerate the sort of time and energy that focusing on the Middle East in the coming year would entail. But that said, it's fairly clear that his top priority in the region is to thwart Iran's nuclear efforts. And so he's already indicated his desire to re-enter the nuclear deal, from which President Trump withdrew in 2018. And he wants to do more than that. He wants to have a follow-on accord that would address other very serious matters with respect to Iran's ballistic missile program that he'd like to curb, to Iran's support for militant groups, its proxies in Syria and Yemen, and Lebanon, and Iraq. And I think he'll also want to address some of Iran's systematic violation of human rights. So these are the kind of top priorities I think he has in the region. I think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and maybe ending some of the other wars in the region, the Syrian civil war and the war in Yemen, may be lower on the priority list.
Jasmine, let's flip that around. If one were looking to Washington from Ramallah, Gaza City, or Nazareth, what might they see that might give them hope?
So I am going to turn this question around a little bit. My sense is, well, to begin with, I think the United States is a very dangerous state. As one historian recently quipped, he said the U.S. is not only the most powerful military in the world, it's probably the most powerful military in the world in history, right? In the history of the world. It is that powerful. I think that what Palestinians and Israelis may be looking to from Ramallah, from Tel Aviv, et cetera, in Washington is not necessarily to Biden and who it is that is in the administration, but rather to another plaza called the Black Lives Matter Plaza. And it's in the Black Lives Matter Plaza that we see new directions, I think, and the potential for alliances around peace and human rights, potential alliances between, for example, Americans who have hope for peace, but also for Israelis and Palestinians who I do not believe will put their, again, with it from the perspective of peace and human rights activists, I don't believe they're going to count on Biden to demilitarize the conflicts in the region at all. This is a region, this is the Biden-Harris duo, let's say, is not, I don't think, committed to changing the relationships which are political, economic, and strategic in the Middle East. I see no no sense of any of that happening. But I do think there's hope. The Democratic Party itself is split on some of these issues. Of course, it's still a minority, but the Black Lives Matter kind of impulse to demilitarize, abolish the police, demilitarize America, if you will, from within, it's there that there may be some hope. And I think there may be some glimmers there that things may change. Over time, it's going to take a very long time. I don't think it's Biden and Harris, but I do think there are things happening in Washington that hold some hope.
Thank you. Uzi, the strengthening of the Israeli right-wing parties in next month elections is inevitable, or looks inevitable. Is it an asset or a liability for peace and stability in the region?
Good question. And the reason that I think it's a good question, because if we look backwards, it was the right-wing Menachem Begin who did a fantastic, very good peace agreement with Egypt after many wars. So, and Benjamin Netanyahu did this peace accord with the Gulf states, and maybe more will join. So I'm not very sure that the re-election of Netanyahu or the other right-wing candidates like Gideon Sa'ar and Naftali Bennett, who was the defense minister, will necessarily lead Israel to any new kind of war. The main problem, of course, is with the Palestinians, because none of the front-running right-wing parties really wants to solve the problem with the Palestinians. They just don't want. They lie, they give some explanations, they produce fake negotiations, but they really don't want. So, I mean, war-wise, I don't think that there will be any deterioration. Paradoxically, if Netanyahu will be re-elected, he's more experienced and very much careful not to get involved in unnecessary wars. But the core issue will remain the Palestinian issue, and if it will not going to be solved very soon, I think I will not be surprised to see another intifada eruption of the Palestinians in the West Bank.
Nicola, what are the opportunities and challenges you think for the international community in resolving these long-standing conflicts?
So I think I'd like to pick up on a point that Jasmine made earlier, which is about non-state actors and transnational movements and alliances for peace and justice. Because I think one of the major issues or major challenges with the current paradigm for the peace process with regards to Israel-Palestine is the way it's been treated as though this is like two national collectivities battling over the same territory, and then there's some sort of territorial compromise that should come out of that. However, you know, for many decades, at least the Palestinians themselves, in the form of the PLO and many of their transnational allies, saw the situation in Israel-Palestine as one of colonialism, and that Israel was a colonizing power, and therefore the issue is not a peace process in a liberal sense. It's about decolonizing the territory and allowing self-determination and human rights and justice for all people living in that territory. And I think, you know, over the last couple of decades, because of the failure of the Palestinian leadership to bring about peace on the basis of this liberal peace paradigm, increasingly younger generations of Palestinians are not looking to the official Palestinian leadership, the Palestinian Authority or Hamas. They're building transnational links with allies who as Jasmine said, are looking for different outcomes. They're looking for much more radical transformation than what's being offered through a liberal peace paradigm. However, those transnational movements are facing important challenges, because Israel does see this as a threat and is trying to delegitimize those sorts of movements, for example, through the promotion of the certain definitions of anti-Semitism that would make it anti-Semitic to question the state of Israel or Jewish self-determination in the form of the state of Israel. So there's a battle going on that's not in the forum of diplomatic arenas, but rather in amongst transnational civil society.
Thank you so much. Guy, some would say, some commentators have said that we are doing the same thing in the Middle East over and over again, yet expecting different results. To what extent will the Biden approach towards the region differ from the previous administration?
So beyond the obvious stylistic differences between Biden and Trump, I think we're going to see a different approach to foreign policy. With Trump, norms were discarded, and what we saw instead were impulsive, erratic, Twitter-centric foreign policy pronouncements. Decisions were largely transactional. Trump's inner circle consisted of loyalists, his son-in-law, his real estate lawyer, his bankruptcy lawyer, rather than experts. And so if Trump was appealing to any audience, it was his domestic base. It was the evangelical community with his pro-Israel stance. It was to other parts of his base for his nativist and to some extent isolationist orientation, the America First approach, for example. With Biden, I think, first of all, Biden is an old foreign policy hand. So he knows the issues, he consults with experts, and rather than nativism and isolationism, I think we're going to see a variety or a variation of liberal internationalism. He is going to work to restore the norms of diplomacy. He's going to try to reassure our allies. He's going to also try to strike a balance between America's values and our interests. And we haven't really seen that since the Obama years. In addition to re-engaging the Palestinians, which the other panelists and myself have already mentioned, I think that it also means bringing human rights up to some extent with our partners, with the Saudis, for example, and cooperating with our European allies, not necessarily bringing them into, say, the peace process with the Palestinians, as Uzi mentioned, but working with them on some of these global problems that we have, and including regional problems in the Middle East, from the Iran nuclear issue to the other conflicts in the region. So I think we're going to see more cooperation with other states, and I think we're going to also see more cooperation with international organizations.
Great, thank you. Uzi, I want to get you to comment on Iran. Is Iran an existential threat to Israel and the region?
Two things here. One, we should remember that till 1979, the year that Ayatollah Khomeini took power in Iran, there were twice a week flights from Tel Aviv to Tehran. There were hundreds of Israeli families living in Tehran, and everyone was happy. And there was a military cooperation. The first Iranian missile project, was held by Israeli experts, and so on. So we might see a change in the regime in Iran, and maybe one day, who knows, secular will take place again, and things will change dramatically. But meanwhile, if you just think from the eyes or the seat of any Israeli prime minister, when the Iranians are very clearly saying our aim is the destruction of the Zionist entity, just think, you are prime minister of Israel. What would you do? I mean, many people saying, well, they're not serious. They know how strong Israel is and nuclear capabilities and all that. But if leaders, time and again, of Iran are demonstrating their will, at least verbally, for the destruction of the state of Israel, every Israeli prime minister should take it very seriously. So I think that basically what we should see here is just to keep go back to the nuclear agreement with the Iranians, contain the possibility of danger, and under no circumstances go into a military confrontation, because this will be a devastation.
So Nicola, does this all imply a rethink for the international community?
So which bit as a rethink? On Iran?
Well, just all these dynamics.
All these dynamics. Well, certainly there's a lot that hasn't been working, and I think the international community has to stop relying on you know, previous paradigms that haven't achieved results. I do think it's very positive that Biden has said that he will bring the US back into the nuclear deal, Iran nuclear deal. I thought that was one of the most positive achievements of the Obama administration in terms of stabilizing regional dynamics within the Middle East. And of course, we do have to look at the ways in which wider regional dynamics play into tensions within countries, or in context, whether it's Israel, Palestine, Syria, Libya, Yemen, you know, all these ongoing conflicts. There needs to be much more of a regional and an international approach. However, of course, that there's also the danger when you do that, that these situations become dominated by the diplomatic interests of the most powerful nations. So it's also about the need to listen to the voices of people on the ground, and bringing in their perspectives as well.
So perspectives, Nathan, talk to us about journalists and political leaders using the terms like peace process. Do they use this term too often when they talk in the context of Israel and Palestine?
Yes, I think they do. You know, the late US diplomat Harold Saunders, he probably did more than anyone to launch the concept of a peace process into public circulation and use by politicians and diplomats. And Saunders is a person who made some positive contributions to our thinking about the relational basis of peacemaking, track to diplomacy, which he was very involved in. He was involved with the Camp David Accords, but also with US-Soviet measures during the 1980s and beyond. And so he made some very well-intentioned contributions. But I think we have to be clear about what a peace process is. It means there has to be some sort of positive reciprocity dynamic underway. There have to be actually dialogues going on at multiple levels that are building some trust and addressing substantive issues that matter to people at the grassroots, as Nicola Pratt mentioned. If that's not happening, and yet we keep talking about the peace process, it tends to create a sense of skepticism and disillusionment. And so I would love to see a peace process here, and I'm in the business of comparing and analyzing peace processes. We shouldn't use the term if there's nothing happening.
Jasmine, what are the essential root and branch, or what is at the root or the design flaws that one can point to in almost every single peace plan ever developed for Middle East conflicts in the 20th century?
I think the starting points actually, and I think Nicola has written about this as well, is the Orientalist approach to the region. So the assumption that every conflict has some primordial root, right? That it's hundreds of years in the making, rather than that, American interests or British interests or Canadian interests or whatever may have something to do with the conflict at hand, that what it is that we're experiencing, what it is that people are experiencing in the moment. And so those Orientalist attitudes, I think, both hinder any kind of plans for a just peace, but also get reinforced. So, for example, in the case of Iraq, let's take it since we've already kind of covered Iran to some extent, but in the case of Iraq, if you were to look to Biden, he promoted, and I think he's been slammed for it, but he promoted the divisions of Iraq as a partition of Iraq as one way forward to resolving the Iraq conflict, as though, again, there were primordial conflicts in the region. The partition plans that, again, from the 1947 to 1967 to Oslo, they're all partition plans. They're all about dividing these communities which have been multinational, multi-religious, et cetera, et cetera. And I think outsiders coming in and reinforcing those kinds of attitudes have actually hindered any kind of movement towards peace. And it is a constant, I'm afraid to say, it is a constant all throughout, that kind of design, the partition as design. And it is the design flaw, I think, of most of these plans, if not all of them.
Thank you. So Nicola, let's just go over to Egypt, an area that you study. On the 10th anniversary of the stepping down of former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, what is your assessment of the possibilities for greater democracy and human rights in Egypt and the region in general?
Sorry. So I think one positive thing about Trump leaving office is that there will not be the same level of turning the blind eye to the human rights abuses that were being committed by the Egyptian regime in the past 7 years or so, and also and some other regimes as well in the region. But in particular, there's been a very strong relationship between Trump and Sisi. And I hope that Biden will at least rein in Sisi a bit. There's 60,000 political prisoners in Egypt at the moment. I mean, this is unprecedented. The level of human rights violations that have happened in Egypt over the last 7 or 8 years are unprecedented. The levels of state repression and violence are unprecedented. However, there are glimmers of hope in the region. Over the past couple of years, there have been increasing movements, not in Egypt, where it's very difficult, but in Lebanon, Iraq, Algeria, in Sudan, movements of young people mainly who want change, and this is not just about an end to repression, more democracy, more freedom, but also about a new social contract. And I think that this has to be really central, I think, anybody seeking to intervene in some way in the region needs to keep in mind that people there want a new social contract, because the old social contract has long died. And what they're being offered at the moment is a mixture of repression and lack of opportunities, social economic opportunities. So there's a role to play also. We haven't talked about the role, for example, of international financial institutions or the US as a donor, not just as a sort of as a diplomatic actor in the Middle East or a military actor. So that these are other things to take into consideration.
Well, you could argue that the Arab Spring was as a result of the uprising of the youth. Now, Uzi, the Arab Spring is really evaporated in Egypt, and why has this happened? And would you say, is 2021 Egypt contributing to regional stability?
Well, it has evaporated, and I was there. I was in the Tahrir Square during the horrible days of the revolution, uprising, or whatever you call it. The main reason that it has evaporated has to do with, I think, with President Obama. He was very quick, too quick, to force Mubarak to resign. And he didn't understand, unfortunately, that he cannot talk democracy in such a way to a 7,000 years civilization, which think in a totally different way. I mean, Many Egyptians are striving for democracy, but it should be done in a different way. Now, what happens in Egypt is that you have new Mubarak there, more, how to say, less democratic, very rough. People are being sent to jail, and the situation. I think the situation in Egypt is not very good. Now, at the same time, Egypt is a source of, so to speak, stability in the region, and the peace between Egypt and Israel is mainly based. It's not peace, unfortunately, between two nations. It's a peace between two military establishments, and this is in one way not good, not for the Israelis, not for the Egyptians. On the other hand, there is a cooperation between the Israelis and the Egyptians, trying to, to force down the fundamentalist terrorist group, etc. So anyway, the bottom line is that definitely Egypt needs democracy, but it should be done in a very clever and different way, and not to force them to run for a democracy from today to tomorrow. Yeah.
Jasmine, what can we learn from some of the peace and social activism in the region?
So wait, I love this question, actually. I think that my own research has been with and alongside Israeli Jewish peace activists, Women in Black, those involved with B'Tselem, Tayush, other organizations. And while there have not had many victories, if you were to look at, say, Israeli Supreme Court decisions, or the popular sensibilities, let's say, of most Israelis, I think what they forced those, particularly in the diaspora, but also within Israel, to consider is essentially it has put the Palestinian question on the agenda. So the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, for example, whether people have signed on to it or not, that movement has become a part of the conversation that's happening at union meetings, at academic associations, in university settings, etc. So you may not want to sign on to it, you may not be supportive of it. It has basically garnered enormous attention from the Israeli state, as well as other states, around questions, as Nicola pointed to, whether or not discussions about Israel or discussions about the Palestinians is informed by anti-Semitism. I have experienced anti-Semitism in the left. I have experienced anti-Arab and Islamophobia in the left, as well as the right. It does exist. Denying that it exists is not really the point. The point is putting Palestine on the agenda, and I think this is what those groups have managed to do. Whether they've won anything, we can't say, but I do think that they have forced liberal Jews like Peter Beinart, for example, from shifting his perspectives on what's possible and what may be, just in the future. So I think that's the role that they've played, and I think it's a really important one. It's not about victory so much as changing the course or the direction of the conversation away from states and borders and back to the ground. How do you want to live? Who wants to live under these conditions? And who has rights?
Thank you. Guy, over to you just on US foreign policy. So it's no secret that President Netanyahu had a very close relationship with Trump, not so much of a great relationship with Obama. So what does this mean for his relationship with Biden? Do you foresee problems with between the two of them?
So we've already seen signs of coolness in the relationship with Netanyahu. Biden is yet to call Prime Minister Netanyahu, and that's a fact that's received quite a bit of attention in Israel in the last couple of weeks. Netanyahu had a very famously poor relationship with President Obama, and very excellent relations with President Trump, which is not exactly the winning formula for a close rapport with the new president. Netanyahu has made no secret of his opposition to the Iran nuclear deal. He actively opposed it. I would say undermined it when Obama was negotiating it. And he's made it clear recently that he opposes re-entering it. But I think at the same time, Biden and Netanyahu have known each other for many, many years. They've actually had an amicable relationship. And I don't think that either one of them wants to have the sort of poor relationship that characterized the Obama years. But at the same time, nobody's under any illusion that this is going to, that Netanyahu is going to enjoy the same relationship with Biden that he had with Trump, whom he repeatedly called Israel's greatest friend. At one point, he likened President Trump to Cyrus the Great. And I don't think that that's something that we're going to see repeated. And invariably, policy differences are going to emerge. There are policy differences in Iran, policy differences on the Palestinian issue, on settlements. So I think that there are going to be some contentious times ahead, but not necessarily the visceral negative reactions we saw during the Obama years.
Nathan, looking ahead, and to all the panelists looking ahead, what are the principles that you think a lasting peace may be constructed on?
Broadly, I'd like to say that norms matter. We need to care about human rights and humanized notion of security, human security. If interest-based politics don't line up with values at some level, we're not making progress on a peace that's worth building. We need to apply our frameworks in more than a transactional way, not in a partisan or purely geopolitical manner. And we need to be inclusive in our attention and concern. So we need to care about the Palestinians, the Yemenis and the humanitarian situation there, the Sahrawis of the Western Sahara. There are many different policy areas that warrant our attention. Responsibility in the arms trade, more inclusive and less oppressive regimes, as has already been mentioned. Tunisia should not be forgotten. They're having trouble. They deserve some attention. Obviously, strategic stability at the nuclear level is vital, and some type of process that can gradually take us beyond this current precarious situation there. And overall, we just need to listen to very diverse voices, especially younger people who want a different future.
So on the issue of younger people, Jasmine, we see the rise of social media and cybersecurity efforts intersecting. Do you foresee an issue of censorship that will make discussions on some of these issues quite difficult?
Yeah, so I touched on this earlier. I do think that with the rise of the adoption of such things as I think it's the International Holocaust Association's definition of anti-Semitism that's being in universities as well, that this may force people underground, if you will, in discussions in their discussions around Palestinian rights. I'm mindful, of course, of the way that Twitter and Facebook has also been designed or has recently been censoring the right, but this could just as easily be used to censor the left and to force those discussions sort of into whatever you want to call the dark web or whatever, rather than out into the open. So I do think that is dangerous, and I don't think it worthwhile. Could I just say one other thing? I mean, so much of our attention has been on Biden in the US and Biden in the US. And I think one of the things, if I could say anything about so much of what's going on in the Middle East, is we need to provide opportunities, and maybe Canada could have this role, for those people who are most affected by these decisions to be able to speak to one another. I think I have a whole lot more in common. I think Israelis and Palestinians have a whole lot more in common than Americans and Palestinians, or Americans and Israelis. And this continuous, it's over there and it's up to them to make those decisions, I think is very dangerous. And it's that insanity that you referred to before. The power is held in different sites, and it's not necessarily on the ground.
Uzi, what about Russia? Should the West be worried about Russia's posture towards the Middle East?
One should take the Russian role in the Middle East very seriously, because during the Trump administration, Putin felt very quickly that Trump is very weak, and he can actually manipulate and do whatever he likes in the Middle East. Once he understood it, Putin, he just sent his troops to Syria. So the Russians are in Syria to stay. They will not leave very soon, and they have a very important role in any future arrangement connecting to Syria, Iraq, Iran, etc. I don't know if many people know, but there is a direct line between the Russian headquarters, Air Force headquarters in Air Force called Khmeimim in west Syria, and the Israeli Air Force headquarters in Tel Aviv. So there is a daily cooperation between the Israeli army military and the Russian military, and also cooperation regarding the Israeli constant Air Force attack on Iranian support and Iranian targets in Syria and in other places. So I think that traditionally the Arabs trust more the Russians than the Americans. So if we are going to any kind of future agreement or arrangement with the Palestinians and others, it will be, in my view, regardless what everyone can think about Putin, it will be very essential that the Russians will be part of the negotiations.
Thank you. I want to turn to some of the questions coming in from the audience and try to get in as many as possible. Guy, I'd like to start with you and ask you, what is the one gesture of a new Biden administration and what they could undertake that would reflect a fresh engagement by the US on a fair-minded peace agreement between Israel and Palestinian Authority?
So I think anything that President Biden does is going to be fresh in comparison with the previous administration. I don't think there's a need to reinvent the wheel. And here, maybe I'll have some differences with some of the other panelists, Uzi and others, who talked about the two-state solution being dead. I don't think that it's dead. I think that it is dying, but I think that it is not too late to preserve the two-state solution, even if it's unlikely to be realized this year, for example. And I think one way to do that is to re-engage the Palestinians. That's already happening. Reopening the consulate that was closed in Jerusalem. That was really the major way that Palestinians communicated with us in Israel, and kind of encourage the leadership that emerges in the elections in Israel, which are taking place next month, assuming that there might be a different leadership if it's not Netanyahu, and it might be a center-right government. But I think that even with a center-right government with some centrist and perhaps center-left elements, I think there could be a renewal of talks to some extent. And whether or not that's going to lead to a two-state solution or a confederation with Jordan, I think that the status quo is something that is not acceptable to the Palestinians. It's not in Israel's best interest. It's certainly not in America's best interest. And I think that having some sort of hope, giving the Palestinians some sort of hope, and giving and kind of renewing the commitment that the United States has to playing a constructive role in mediating this longstanding conflict, I think would be welcome by most elements there.
Thank you. Uzi, question for you. Considering the possibility of US rejoining the Iran nuclear deal, there's a lot of talk in recent weeks about a potential rapprochement between GCC states and Iran. So what do you think will be Israel's position on the potential dialogue in the Persian Gulf region? Does Israel consider any de-escalation of tensions with Iran as a threat?
I tell you, again, it depends who will be the Israeli Prime Minister next month. I think Netanyahu, and even if there will be another right-wing center, if you want, Prime Minister elected, I think they might going very rough on the Iranians because of the fear of nuclear capability with the Iranians, which Israel is promised that no prime minister will accept. How that will affect the regional peace agreement or achievements, or with the Gulf state, I think that the interest of the Gulf state, or at least some of the Gulf state, that Israel will continue to be very tough on the Iranians because they are threatening them as well. But if you ask my view, I mean, everyone should calm down the situation because it's very volatile. The Iranians have their so-called militia in Lebanon with hundreds of thousands of rockets that can practically cripple Israel. It's a serious issue. The first time the IDF cannot defend fully the heart of Israel. Israelis don't like to talk about it, but the situation is very volatile. And I think that in this case, the impact or the influence of the Biden administration to calm down the situation is essential.
Jasmine, what is the impact of American Jews who support justice for Palestinians on the peace process?
I think that the American Jews who support justice for Palestinians are an enormous group, enormously helpful and enormously important in the American context. I don't think they're important in the Israeli context. That is, they can put pressure on the American government, but we can't expect them to put pressure on the Israeli government. Israelis have their own debates, their own discussions. Some of them are actually much more forward than anything that's going on within the American Jewish communities. And so I think asking that American Jews put pressure on Israelis is actually, it's the same kind of argument that's been used with the BDS movement, which I think will fail on those grounds. I think that the desire for peace and the alliances need to be built within Israeli and Palestinian communities and not from the United States. I think we need to move away from that model.
Nicola, a couple of questions on the impacts of COVID-19 on peace and security in the region. Any views?
So I think this is where a human security perspective is really important, which Nathan mentioned a while ago. COVID-19 is having a detrimental effect to people's livelihoods, obviously for those people who catch it, and it's obviously having a detrimental effect to health as well. It's putting a lot of strain on healthcare facilities, and I think one of the really, really essential roles that the international community can play is in supporting the Middle East countries to come out of a COVID crisis. I mean, obviously, this is going to be a challenge facing the whole world. That the economic impacts of COVID are extremely serious for all countries. But this is again where we need to rethink some of the economic prescriptions that have been promoted up until now, in terms of neoliberal economic models. And there needs to be, again, bringing it back to the idea, there needs to be a new social contract, and part of that social contract is decent economic opportunities for all, being able to live with dignity, decent livelihoods, etc.
Thank you so much. I want to just do a quick sweep on your top tip for the policy world. What would you leave us off with? Uzi, start with you.
Well, I would have thought that the intervention of the European, American, and Russia in the future Middle East peace attempt, not only with the Israelis, is essential. However, the European and the American should let the parties to decide for themselves, and remember always that you are talking with a different civilization, different understanding of what is democracy, and let the sides decide for themselves, help them, but not guide them, but not more than that.
Thank you. Guy, what would you say to the policy world?
I would say that if America doesn't lead, others will, and U.S. interests will be harmed. So I think it's important that the U.S. remains engaged in the region and does so not unilaterally, multilaterally, in cooperation with other allies and friends in the region and in Europe and elsewhere. So specifically, I think that I'd like to see the Biden administration work with our European allies to negotiate a new version of the JCPOA and follow-on agreements that will address other issues that we have with Iran. I'd like to see the Biden administration building on the momentum of the Abraham Accords by deepening the normalization process with the signatories, but also encouraging other Arab states to normalize relations with Israel and bringing back the Palestinians into the fold. And finally, incorporating human rights into our agenda by making it clear to our partners, the Saudis and others, that we no longer will turn a blind eye to flagrant human rights abuses, that there will be consequences.
Thank you so much. I think we've run out of time and we can hold our audience much past 12 noon. So thank you so much to the panelists. That was so rich in content. I learned a great deal and I'm sure our audience did too. Thanks so much and join us next week, same time, same place, and same link for a look at the challenge of forced displacement. For now then, I bid farewell, take care and stay safe.